Does the new Canon EOS R8 overheat? Canon's mirrorless cameras have been infamous for their overheating issues, and I know people are concerned about this even though Canon has improved a lot in the overheating issues. But what about the all-new Canon EOS R8? I tested out the overheating and the battery life of this camera in video mode because I know those two things might be things people are thinking about before buying this camera, and I have some good news and some bad news, so let's start off with the overheating. Canon says that if the camera's internal temperature becomes too high, the recording time may reduce, but what does this actually mean? I ran my overheating tests indoors in a regular room temperature with the screen flipped open, plugged into USB-C power, recording internally to an SD card. In IPB light compression. The compression shouldn't matter at all in terms of overheating, and I just wanted to save some memory card space, so that's why I chose IPB light, but the same results apply for IPB as well. So let's start off with 4K at 30 frames per second. The camera actually has a recording limit of 2 hours, but at 2 hours I don't think the recording limit actually matters, but I let the camera run for 2 hours and then I hit record straight away again. Canon claims that there is no overheating in the lower frame rates, and this claim turned out to be true. I let the camera run for about 4 hours and then I got bored, so it's safe to say that there is no overheating in 4K in 30 frames per second or lower. Now going up to 60 frames per second, things get a little bit more disappointing. Canon says that shooting in 4K 60 frames per second without overheating issues is possible for approximately 30 minutes, so I started the clock and hit record. When you go into 4K at 50 or 60 frames per second, the camera actually shows a message telling you that the camera might overheat in these settings. One cool thing about the newer R series cameras is that they have an indicator showing how hot they are on a scale from 1 to 10 and tell you when they might overheat. After 15 minutes of shooting in 4K 60 frames per second, the indicator was up at 5 bars, and after 24 minutes it was already up at the full 10 bars. After 26 minutes of shooting in 4K 60 frames per second, the camera shut down due to overheating. So if you kind of start at 0 and let the camera run in 4K 60 frames per second, you can shoot for 26 minutes before the camera overheats. But after it overheat, I let the camera cool down for 15 minutes, and at that point it was only showing 1 bar in the overheating indicator, and I could shoot for 17 minutes straight more, so it kind of cools down quite quickly. Basically you get as much recording time as you keep it turned off. So the R8 does overheat, but with the cooldown time and the fact that you would only shoot in short bursts in the higher frame rates makes me think that it doesn't really matter in real life use. Oh, and one more thing to note is that if it overheats, you can go back to the lower frame rates like 30 or 25 frames per second and shoot without any overheating issues from there on. So that considering as well, I don't really think the overheating is an issue with the R8, even though it does technically overheat. But what about the battery life? I did my battery life tests in 30 frames per second and in 50 frames per second, and the results weren't really too good, which is actually what I expected because of the small battery of the R8. In 30 frames per second I could only shoot for 1 hour and 6 minutes, and in 50 frames per second the results were even worse at only 47 minutes. So if the battery of your camera only lasts for 1 hour or less, you're gonna have to carry around a few extra batteries with you. Now, as expected, the battery life of the R8 really isn't too good. I will be testing the battery out more in the real world as well, but according to this test at least, the battery life isn't looking too promising. So in conclusion, the R8 does overheat in 4K 50 or 60 frames per second, but in the real world I don't think it's a major issue with this camera, but on the other hand the battery life is going to be an issue. But in the end it's not meant to be a professional camera, and it is a tiny camera, so the battery also has to be very small, so you can't expect the battery life to be fantastic. But that is all I have for today. If there's any questions about this camera that you have, just drop a comment down below and I'll do my best to answer you. So thank you for watching, and I hope I will see you in the next one.